Imagine this. You are traveling through a desert road. The sun is brutal, the dust never stops, and somewhere ahead of you, a chariot is moving slowly through the heat. Inside that chariot, a man is reading. Not just reading anything, he is reading one of the most important religious texts ever written. But here's the strange part. He does not understand a single word of it. Now, this man is not poor. He is not some wandering stranger with nothing to lose. He is one of the most powerful officials in his entire country. He controls the royal treasury. He answers directly to the queen. He has crossed hundreds of miles just to seek something. And yet, he is holding the answer in his hands, and he cannot read between the lines. That moment, right there on a forgotten desert road, may have been the spark that brought an entire faith to an entire continent. Before Christianity became the religion of Rome, before it spread through Europe and was carried across the world by empires, it may have already arrived in Africa, quietly, personally, through one man, and that man was from Ethiopia. Now, I know what some of you are already thinking. Ethiopia? In the Bible? I never heard about that. That is exactly the point. This story is one of the most overlooked moments in early religious history. And once you understand who this man really was, where he came from, and what he carried back home, you will never look at the early history of Christianity the same way again. So stay with me, because this does not start with an empire. It does not start with a massive crowd. It starts with a conversation on a road in the middle of nowhere. And that one conversation may have changed the course of an entire civilization. Let us set the scene properly. The story comes from the book of Acts, chapter 8. It is one of the shortest significant encounters in the entire New Testament. Most people read it once, nod, and move on. But if you slow down and actually think about what is happening here, the details become remarkable. A man named Philip is traveling. He is moving through a road that runs from Jerusalem down toward Gaza, a desert road, quiet, mostly empty. Then he sees something, a chariot moving at a steady pace through the dust. And from inside that chariot, he can hear something. Someone is reading out loud. Now, in the ancient world, reading was almost always done out loud. It was how people processed text. So Philip hears the words being spoken, and he recognizes them immediately. The man in the chariot is reading from the book of Isaiah, one of the most poetic, complex, and debated sections of the Hebrew Scripture. A passage about a figure described as a suffering servant, a figure that early followers of Jesus believed was a direct prophecy about him. Philip gets closer, and then, here is the moment that most people just skip over. He asks a simple question. Do you understand what you are reading? And the man in the chariot looks up and says something honest, something vulnerable, something that almost no powerful person ever admits. He says, "How can I? Unless someone guides me." Think about that for a second. This is not a random traveler. This is a high-ranking official, someone who has access to wealth, knowledge, and authority. And yet, he is sitting in his chariot, reading words that feel important and openly admitting that he does not fully understand them. That kind of intellectual honesty is rare in any era. Philip climbs up into the chariot. He sits beside this man, and he begins to explain. Not with miracles, not with signs from the sky, just with knowledge, just with context, with the kind of explanation that takes a confusing passage and suddenly makes everything click. And right there, on that dusty road, something shifts. Not dramatically, not with thunder, just quietly, the way real understanding always works. This was not just a conversion. This was the moment that knowledge crossed a border. And the question is, what border exactly? Which brings us to the man himself, because he is far more important than most people realize. The Bible refers to him simply as an Ethiopian eunuch. And most people read that phrase and they picture a nameless servant, someone in the background of a bigger story. But let us actually unpack those two words because they tell us a great deal more than they appear to. First, Ethiopian. In the ancient world, Ethiopia did not refer to exactly the same geographic boundaries as today. The region was often called Kush, or the land of the Kushites. It was associated with the powerful kingdom south of Egypt, a civilization that had its own dynasties, its own rulers, its own trade networks. This was not a forgotten corner of the world. This was a place with history, structure, and serious influence. Now the second word, eunuch. This is the word most people feel uncomfortable with, and so they skip past it. But here is what the word actually tells us in the context of ancient royal courts. In many civilizations of that era, eunuchs held some of the highest administrative positions available, precisely because they were seen as completely loyal to the crown. They had no competing family ambitions, no desire to build their own dynasty, no reason to betray the ruler they served. And this man, the man in the chariot, was not just any official. He was in charge of the royal treasury. He was the financial minister of the Ethiopian queen, a queen the ancient sources often referred to by the title Candace. Now here is something worth pausing on. Candace was actually a royal title in the ancient Kushite tradition, similar to how Pharaoh was a title and not just a personal name. Historians have documented multiple queens who held that title over generations. So when we say the Candace of the Ethiopians, we are talking about one of the most powerful rulers in that entire region. And the man in the chariot was her most trusted financial officer. He had just made a long journey to Jerusalem. He had gone there to worship, which tells us he was already drawn to Jewish scripture and tradition. He was searching. He was someone with resources, with influence, with a position in the highest levels of government. And now, on a road back home, he has just had an encounter that answered questions he had been carrying for a long time. Think about what that means. When someone like that changes what they believe, it does not stay personal. It cannot stay personal. Ideas do not stay contained when the person carrying them has access to power. Let me ask you this. Do you think a man in his position would have kept this to himself, or do you think he would have shared it? Leave your answer in the comments, because this is where the story gets genuinely fascinating. The book of Acts tells us one final detail about this man. After Philip baptizes him at a body of water along the road, the man continues on his journey. And the text says he went on his way rejoicing. That is it. He disappears from the biblical narrative. No follow-up, no mention of what happened next, just he went home. And for most readers, that is where the story ends. But think about it logically. A high-ranking official, trusted by the queen, who has just experienced a profound personal transformation, is now traveling back to a country with its own established belief systems, its own structures of power. What happens when he arrives? We cannot know for certain. There are no surviving documents from that exact moment, but we can use historical logic, and when we do, a few possibilities emerge very naturally. He would have shared his experience with the people closest to him, servants, advisors, people who traveled with him, people who trusted him and would have listened. As a figure of influence in the royal court, his beliefs would have been visible. In ancient societies, the personal convictions of powerful officials were rarely private. They showed up in what those officials supported, funded, and promoted. And he would have returned as someone with a story, not just a doctrine, not just a set of rules, but a personal story of understanding something he had been searching for. And that kind of story spreads. History shows us over and over again, ideas move fastest through people with access, not through the masses first, through the individuals who already have the trust of others. Religions do not always begin with crowds gathering in squares. Sometimes they begin with one conversation, in a chariot, on a desert road, and then they spread, quietly, person by person, until one day you look up and something has shifted. Now here's the part that historians find genuinely interesting. Ethiopia would eventually become one of the earliest nations in the world to officially adopt Christianity. The Kingdom of Aksum, which is the civilization that historically corresponds to ancient Ethiopia, made Christianity its official state religion in the 4th century AD, under a king named Ezana. That is roughly the same time as Constantine in Rome, or even slightly before, depending on the source. So here's a question worth sitting with. Was that 4th century adoption sudden, or was it the result of something that had been building for a very long time? Was there already a foundation, already a small community of believers who had been quietly keeping that faith alive for generations? That is not a religious claim, that is a historical question, and it is one that scholars have been debating for years. To understand why this story is plausible as a genuine historical starting point, you have to understand a little bit about what Ethiopia was like at that time. The Kingdom of Kush had already developed complex urban centers, cities with temples, marketplaces, trade routes that connected them to Egypt, Arabia, and the Mediterranean. By the time of our man in the chariot, roughly the 1st century AD, the region was part of what would become the Kingdom of Aksum, a trading empire, one of the most important commercial hubs in the ancient world. Ships moved through the Red Sea. Goods flowed between Africa, India, and the Mediterranean. Aksum had its own written language, its own coinage, its own architecture. This was a sophisticated, connected civilization, not isolated, not primitive, deeply embedded in the networks of the ancient world. And here is something that matters a great deal for our story. The population already had a relationship with religious ideas. There is strong historical evidence that there were Jewish communities in Ethiopia long before the 1st century AD. Some scholars point to ancient traditions linking Ethiopia to the heritage of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Others point to the Beta Israel community, the Ethiopian Jews, as evidence of a long and documented relationship between Ethiopia and the Hebrew faith. This matters because it means the man in the chariot was not encountering something completely foreign. He was already familiar with Jewish scripture. He had traveled to Jerusalem specifically to worship. He was reading Isaiah in his chariot. He was not a complete outsider to the tradition. He was someone on the edge of it, searching for a deeper understanding. And that is precisely the type of person who, when they hear a clear explanation of something they have been circling for years, does not just accept it, they absorb it completely, and they carry it back with them. The message did not arrive in an empty landscape. It arrived in a place that already had the intellectual and spiritual soil to receive it. So let me ask you this. Do you think the early spread of Christianity in Africa gets enough attention in mainstream history? Drop a comment, because I genuinely want to know what you think. Now, here's the part that I think is genuinely worth pausing on. Let us talk about the timeline. The standard version of Christian history that most people learn goes something like this. Jesus lived and taught in Judea. His followers spread the message through the Roman Empire. It eventually reached Rome itself. Constantine converted, and from there, Christianity spread across Europe and eventually the world. That's the broad outline, and it is not wrong, but it is also incomplete, because that version of history centers everything around Rome, and Rome was not the only civilization in the ancient world. Let us look at the actual dates. The encounter between Philip and the Ethiopian official takes place, according to historical and biblical scholarship, somewhere in the early to mid-1st century AD, likely within a decade or two of the crucifixion of Jesus. This is very early. This is before Paul has completed his major missionary journeys. This is before any formal church structure exists. This is at the very beginning of the movement. And already, at that earliest moment, there is a direct connection being made to Africa, to a man from a powerful African kingdom, who then goes home. Now contrast that with Rome. Christianity was officially tolerated in Rome only in 313 AD under Constantine. It became the official state religion of the Roman Empire in 380 AD. That's roughly 3 to 4 centuries after our man in the chariot.
I'm not saying Africa was ahead in some competitive sense. That framing is not very useful historically. What I am saying is this. The timeline that most people have in their heads, the one where Africa received Christianity late through European missionaries, that timeline may simply not be accurate, or at least it may be missing a very early chapter. History often follows power. Empires write the records, and the records that survive tend to reflect the perspective of whoever was doing the writing. But that does not mean other stories didn't happen. It just means they were not always written down in ways that survived. And sometimes, just sometimes, the first chapter of a much bigger story is not written where we expect it to be. So if this moment is so significant, why does it only take up a few verses in the book of Acts? Why is there no follow-up? No record of the man arriving home, no description of what happened next? This is a fair question, and I want to give you a fair answer. Not a conspiracy, not a cover-up story, just honest historical reasoning. There are a few simple explanations. The first is the most obvious. We just don't have the records. Ancient written records were fragile. Papyrus deteriorated. Libraries burned. Wars destroyed archives. The survival of any ancient document is almost accidental. The fact that we have what we have is remarkable. The fact that we are missing things is not a conspiracy, it's just reality. The second reason is that the book of Acts had a specific focus. It was primarily documenting the spread of the movement through the Eastern Mediterranean, through Antioch, through Asia Minor, through Greece, toward Rome. That was the narrative arc its author was tracing. A story that went south into Africa and then disappeared from the main account would not have fit neatly into that arc. And in ancient writing, what did not fit the main story was often not expanded on. Third, and this is the one I find most interesting, the story may have felt less remarkable to its original audience than it does to us. Philip baptizing someone from a foreign country was part of a pattern. The entire point of that chapter in Acts is the expansion of the movement beyond its original community. So one more conversion, even of a foreign official, may have been recorded briefly precisely because it was seen as one more example of a larger pattern, not because it was small, but because it fit into a category the author was already documenting.
History does not always erase things. Sometimes it just does not expand on them. And sometimes the details we most need to understand something are sitting quietly in a sentence or two, waiting for someone to slow down and actually pay attention. Let us zoom out for a moment and hold the whole picture at once. A man from an advanced African civilization, a man of significant power and access, he travels to Jerusalem voluntarily to engage with a tradition he has been studying. He encounters someone who helps him understand something he has been searching for. He accepts that understanding completely. He is baptized. He goes home. And history, at least the written history we have access to, falls mostly silent on what happened next. But we know what came later. We know that Ethiopia became one of the earliest nations to formally adopt Christianity. We know that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church traces its own origins back to the 1st century. We know that there is a continuous tradition maintained within that church for nearly 2,000 years that directly connects its founding to the story of this man. Now, I want to be precise here. This is a tradition, not a document with a clear chain of evidence. Historians are careful about the difference between tradition and documentation, and that distinction is worth respecting. But here is what I will say. The fact that a tradition exists, that a community of believers has maintained for centuries, that their faith traces back to this one encounter, that is itself historically significant. Communities do not usually invent founding stories out of nothing. They usually preserve something, a memory, a name, a chain of connection that, even if blurred over time, points back to something real. And when you combine that tradition with the documented facts, the man's actual position of power, his proximity to the queen, the early date of the encounter, the logic of how that spark could have grown into something larger becomes very hard to dismiss. Big changes in history rarely start with big moments. They start with quiet ones, a conversation in a chariot, a question asked honestly, an answer given clearly, and then a journey home with something new. We started this story on a desert road, a powerful man, a confusing text, a stranger who climbed into his chariot and explained it all, and then silence. He went on his way, rejoicing. Before Christianity became the religion of Rome, before it crossed the Mediterranean and shaped the Western world, it may have already begun a quiet journey through the heart of Africa. Not with an army, not with an empire behind it, with one man who understood something and went home to share it. Now, I want to ask you something directly, and I'm genuinely curious what you think. Do you believe this was just a small moment in a larger story, a footnote that happened to be recorded, or do you think this was actually the beginning of something that history never fully explained because we were not looking in the right direction? Let me know in the comments, because honestly, this is exactly the kind of story where the real discussion happens after the video ends. If you had never heard about this story before today, that is not surprising. It is the kind of detail that is easy to overlook when you are focused on the more famous chapters. But sometimes the most important pages in a history book are the ones with the fewest words on them, the ones where something happened and the world moved and almost nobody wrote it down properly. The deeper you look into the earliest years of Christianity, the more Africa keeps appearing, in places you did not expect, in roles you were never taught about, in stories that have been sitting quietly in plain sight for 2,000 years. That thread does not end here. If you want to keep following it, I will see you in the next video.